Alright, we're finally cooling off the Sonic Frontiers release, so I want to hear what everyone has to say for what we should do for our next game. We have so many different characters to use here at Sega, so I want to open the floor up to everyone and see what ideas we all have. How about a racing game with everyone, but we only use Sonic's name in the title? Or maybe a party game like Mario Party, but only with Sonic characters? Or why don't we just go a little bit out there and just do a completely different game, like a new Phantasy Star or something? Those are all good ideas, guys. I appreciate your input on it, everyone, but I have a better idea. Why don't we do a new, buggy, and glitchy Sonic game? Genius. That guy is so smart. Why couldn't I? We've never done that before.
When you go back through history and take a look at different video games and their developers, there's a couple of names that always need to be brought up. Nintendo, Sony, Atari all left their marks on the video game industry, with Nintendo and Sony still being at the forefront to this day, and then there's Atari.
Man, I love Atari!
Atari was one of Nintendo's earliest big competitors, as they were in the video game console market even before Nintendo. But they couldn't keep up with the times, released a game about an alien, crashed the video game market, so you know, the usual. Once the mid-90s rolled around, a new competitor entered the ring and began to threaten Nintendo's throne. Sony originally was working with Nintendo to develop a CD add-on to the Super Nintendo that would have been called the Nintendo PlayStation. That just sounds wrong. They had some disagreements during development, and Nintendo decided to cut ties with Sony, which I'm sure won't come to bite them in the ass. I'm sure Sony won't take their experience working with Nintendo and go on to produce a brand new console that will continuously outsell Nintendo's console for the next 30 years. Well, that escalated quickly. Sony has been Nintendo's main rival in the video game market since the mid to late 90s. They're always at the top of the industry, and even though Microsoft with Xbox is a big third developer, nobody really sees Xbox as a rival. PlayStation and Nintendo are doing this to keep their brands alive, while Microsoft does it just because they fucking can and they don't care. But before PlayStation and after Atari, there was a few-year gap where neither one of them were Nintendo's biggest rival. Oh no, there was a different company who threw themselves into the video game console market who had maybe the biggest and meanest rivalry with Nintendo in their history. That company, of course, would be none other than Sega. See, even though Sony and Nintendo are rivals and want to beat each other, they still have a bit of respect for each other. Neither ever outright says anything bad about the other, and they even work or lend a hand on some projects nowadays. Show someone an image of Cloud fighting Mario in Smash Bros. Back in 1999 and they would think the apocalypse happened. Sega, on the other hand,
hey, I'm Sega. Nice to meet you. I'm Nintendo. Fuck you. Okay.
Sega didn't try to hide how much they despised Nintendo. They made entire marketing strategies around different ways of saying, Nintendo fucking blows, buy our stuff instead. Interesting tactic when you could just make good games and products instead, but this is Sega we're talking about. Sega had a right to be a little cocky with their systems at the time though. They had a big fan base and were easily the biggest developer after Nintendo. Sega, just like Nintendo, began their game development with arcade machines and quickly shifted to home consoles in the 1980s. Their first ever console was the SG-1000, which sold decently for its expectations, however it didn't hold a candlestick to the Famicom and NES. To improve on the system, they created a Mark III version which was rebranded to the name we all know today as the Sega Master System. And with a name like Master System, you'd think this would be the system that everyone in the world would want to master. I'm sure someone out there wants to. The Master System did not sell well in either North America or Japan. They couldn't capture an audience and struggled to market the system. They tried partnering with Tonka, that didn't work. They tried marketing it as a toy instead of an electronic, that didn't work. They tried selling it to people who speak Portuguese in South America, holy shit, that worked. Sega partnered with Tectoy to distribute the console in Brazil, and by 1990, they already had an install base of almost 300,000. They beat Nintendo to the South American market and took control so quickly that by the time Nintendo arrived in 1993, they stood no chance as Tectoy controlled 80% of the video game market. They even sell thousands of Master System consoles every year to this day, which is honestly kind of remarkable. But Brazil wasn't the only market where the Master System saw success. They also got a big reach in the United Kingdom and throughout Europe. Sega worked with Virgin Mastertronic to distribute the system in the UK, and that's just a perfect metaphor for this system. The Virgin Sega versus the Chad Nintendo, the battle of the ages. Nintendo didn't focus as much on the European market, which allowed Sega to effectively market to Europe. Virgin Mastertronic focused a lot on marketing Sega's arcade games on the system to show its superiority to others like the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum computers. By the end of the 1980s and into 1990, the Master System was outselling every other console across Europe. That's a big win for the virgins over at Sega. Except they were no longer going to be virgins after Nintendo fucked them in every other market. The Master System did not sell well in North America or Japan, and that's putting it nicely. They just couldn't break through and didn't have the games or characters to sell well. They needed a company mascot who people would buy systems for because, as it currently stood, This ain't gonna cut it. Sega needs a character who stands out, is cool, and has a color that rivals Mario as his opposite.
Beige!
Development on Sega's next console started in the late 80s, as Sega knew they needed to keep pushing the power level towards 16 bits if they wanted to remain relevant. Sega was taking this new console much more seriously than the Master System, and they specifically designed their console to be more sleek and appear like an electronic appliance like a radio player instead of a toy the way Nintendo had done with the Famicom, even taking inspiration from cars too, because that's what I want my game console to look like. A Mini Cooper. They believed giving it this look would make the system appeal to all audiences and not limit themselves to a younger crowd. The last thing they needed to come up with was a name. That led us to the name of the Mega Drive. Damn, they took that car design even into the name. But that was only the name of the console in Japan and Europe. North America got its completely own unique title because America is full of crazy religious fucks, so they decided to name the console after a book in the Bible.
I got it! Sega Leviticus!
They decided on Genesis, as it was a new age and a new beginning for Sega, and I can't lie, this is an awesome console name. I'm so glad they tried to be unique and didn't follow Nintendo's naming trend at the time. Could you imagine if the Genesis was just called the Super Master System? They would have died a decade earlier than they originally did. The Genesis officially released in 1988 in Japan, with releases in North America and Europe over the next 2 years. The console started off strong, with the initial production being sold out within the first 2 days, but only 400,000 were sold in the first year overall. The Genesis was still looking to lag behind Nintendo, but that would soon change when Sega did something drastic. They told Nintendo to go fuck themselves.
Super Monaco GP free or columns free. What Nintendo?
We don't see this kind of disrespect anymore these days. Companies take jabs at each other here and there, but Sega positioned their entire marketing around showing how much better their console was than Nintendo. This would be a horrible marketing strategy if they didn't have any amazing exclusives to attract customers. But that's one thing Sega really prioritized this generation. They managed to create tons of games with famous athletes and icons to get their name on their games. Joe Montana football, Arnold Palmer tournament golf, and Michael Jackson Moonwalker were just a few. But here's the thing. That looks more like Joe Idaho to me. Even with these big names sponsoring their games, Sega still struggled to catch up to Nintendo, so Sega decided to make a few changes. They hired a new CEO of Sega of America, a white guy in a suit.
Where?
Thomas Kalinske decided to follow the Razor Blade model to help propel Sega ahead. Because Razor Blades never hurt anyone, this model really only had 2 major aspects that were important.
Okay everyone, so we're going to cut the price of the system to make it more affordable for everyone, and then we're also going to get rid of whatever the hell this pack-in title is and replace it with a fucking cute blue hedgehog.
Sonic the Hedgehog was Sega's big new mascot that was going to take the world by storm, and as everyone was waiting for Nintendo's next console, the Super Nintendo, Sonic burst onto the scene and convinced consumers to purchase a Genesis instead. Because fuck plumbers, hedgehogs are where it's at. Because of how widely acclaimed Sonic became, Sega outsold Nintendo consoles nearly 2-1 during the holiday season of 1991, and by January, Sega controlled nearly 2/3 of the 16-bit console market. Sega even outsold Nintendo for the next 4 Christmas seasons, so it wasn't just a one-time thing. The console had a 2-year lead on the Super Nintendo, the console was cheaper, and the game library was massive! Sonic wasn't the only game that was pushing people to purchase a Genesis. Sega went out of their way to produce similar and sometimes even the same games as Nintendo, but just with extra content to make their game superior. Nintendo had Final Fight, so Sega created Streets of Rage, which is the same concept of game with similar controls but better levels, harder enemies, and great music. And then there was the real reason everyone would want to play a Genesis over a Super Nintendo: Mortal Kombat. Do you like blood? That was a test, and if you answered yes, I'm putting you on a list. Because Nintendo positions themselves as family friendly, they made sure their version of Mortal Kombat only had the characters sweat when they were hit with attacks instead of being anything more gruesome. Sega, on the other hand, oh, they don't give a shit about kids' well-beings. Bring on the blood! Sega's version of the game had a cheat code that would change the sweat to blood, which is what Mortal Kombat is all about. Nobody plays this game to see the punches and the kicks. All anyone wants to see is someone getting their spines yanked out and then bleed to death. And this was still only rated for 13-year-olds. Sega really tried to put forth how their console was for everyone, with games ranging from all over, and it definitely helped them find success. I mean, after all of that, I'm sure they won the generation against Nintendo. Nintendo, you fucking swine, how? There was also another console Sega made during this time that I haven't mentioned until now because it really stood no chance against Nintendo: the Game Gear. It was portable, had a good screen, but had no games. It had to go up against the best-selling handheld of all time. Moving on. Video games were beginning to shift away from cartridges and use CDs instead. New competitors were entering the ring, with Sony creating the first PlayStation, so Sega needed to keep up with the times if they wanted to replicate any of the success they had with the Genesis, which is where the Sega Saturn comes in.
Saturn and success in the same sentence.
The Sega Saturn, oh the Sega Saturn. Why? It wasn't a bad idea for Sega to create a new console using CDs, as CDs are cheaper to produce and contain more memory on them than a cartridge. Sega first unveiled it and announced a retail price of $399. This was 1994. Even Sony couldn't believe it, and they took a nice jab at them during their reveal of the PlayStation when they walked up on stage and said,
$299.
When someone who's never made a console before is making fun of you, that's your cue to pack it up and go home. Sega ended up pushing the Saturn out earlier than originally planned in North America and Europe to get ahead of the PlayStation, to the point that there were only 6 games available at launch. We're not off to a great start here. The quick release caught retailers off guard, and many weren't prepared to start selling the system with others still in their stock. Throw in the fact that Sega created like 10 billion add-ons for the Genesis with like only 2 that were good. Nobody knew what the hell they were supposed to buy. The Genesis continued to sell well, as people weren't willing to fork over the money for a new console when the Genesis could do all that they needed. The Saturn didn't have any system-selling titles or revolutionary games to say that they wanted a Saturn over a Genesis. I'd be concerned if they did. Sega was trying so hard to shift to the Saturn that they completely left the Genesis in the dust, which made many fans angry. They wanted a new Genesis, not a console with no games, no marketing, and no more CEO who made the Genesis successful. Thomas Kalinske had continued disagreements with Sega of Japan and lost his interest in his work with the company. Kalinske officially left at the end of September 1996, which in my opinion is the true start of Sega's decline. He was the one guy who knew how to market the system in America, but Sega wanted to stay true to their Japan approach, which was vastly different, as the markets and people are vastly different in the 2 continents. The new executive vice president, Bernie Stolar, straight up said at E3 1997 that the Saturn was not their future. Well, that's just what you should say as the face of the company. You all wasted your $400, dumbasses. Ha! There were a lot of reasons the Saturn wasn't getting the support it needed. One of the biggest being developers not having adequate time or resources to complete their games. The biggest victim of this was Sonic X-treme. This was supposed to be the big Sonic title for the system and was going to be the series' first jump into 3D. Sega essentially forced the developers to remake the entire game after having so much of it done, all without pushing back the game's release date. This was made even worse when Stolar took away access to one of their game's engines that they needed to complete the project. Programmers began to quit or even get sick, which ended up causing the game to get cancelled. Nothing about that was extreme. This could have been the game that people would have finally purchased a Saturn for, but instead Sega almost killed their staff. Which, to be fair, would you rather play a Saturn or die?
I'll take my chances.
By the end of the Saturn's life, the PlayStation was running circles around it, and once the Nintendo 64 came out, they might as well have just hosted the funeral right there. Due to the system's failure, even with a lucrative marketing campaign, Sega reported a net loss of over $300 million in 1998's fiscal year. Doing so poorly, Sega did the unthinkable. They sunk another $500 million more into another failed console. Come on! Sega began to leak information themselves about their new console to get people excited. There were many pre-orders and people were ready to play all the new games. I'm sensing a trend here. Sega's new console was called the Dreamcast, launching in 1998 in Japan with releases in 1999 for North America and Europe. Despite there only being 4 games at launch in Japan, there were 19 at launch in North America, including one of the most anticipated titles, Sonic Adventure. This was the game that Sonic X-treme was supposed to be, the game to rival Mario 64 and bring Sega back from the depths of hell.
I give it a week.
Sonic Adventure is a very good game for the time, but it didn't have nearly the impact of Nintendo's groundbreaking titles. Everyone who played the game enjoyed it. The problem was, only like 10 people played it and 9 of them worked at Sega. Sega's sales weren't horrible overall, but they just didn't match up to the PlayStation, who was dominating the market. And then once Sony revealed the PS2 in 1999, it was strictly a competition for second against the guys who consistently outsold them every generation. Sega was fucked from the beginning, and then they were double fucked when many developers like EA said they wouldn't develop games for them due to constantly changing hardware and making it difficult to develop for their systems. It's honestly sad the Dreamcast didn't do too well, as it was a very cool and innovative system. Using memory cards in the controller that could be taken out and played on is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. Unnecessary as shit, but so is the 3DS's nipple, and you don't see me complaining about that. It was also one of the first consoles to allow for online gaming with their service SegaNet. It cost a small mortgage, but they needed all the money they could get at this point, so can you really blame them? The price for the Dreamcast began at $199, and even with a price cut to $149, they were still struggling to sell consoles. They needed to sell at least 5 million units by the end of 2000 in the US, but they ended up only reaching about 3 million sold. By the end of its life, it was outsold by 8-1 compared to the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. Probably about 6.5 of that was PlayStation, but Nintendo had the Game Boy, they didn't care. But then finally, on January 31st, 2001, Sega announced the discontinuation of the Dreamcast and took a step back to becoming solely a third-party developer. To get rid of the Dreamcast inventory, they marked it down to $99, then to $79, and then finally to $49.95. It was cheaper than buying groceries, and people still didn't want it. That's just depressing. With Sega's shift to third-party developer, they began to port over some of their bigger titles to other platforms, with the most notable being Sonic Adventure 2 Battle to the GameCube. This was one of the first Sonic games I ever played, and I had no idea I was eating the corpse of a dead Japanese company.
I'm full.
Sega has still managed to stay afloat over the years by making tons of games for different consoles. Oh, who am I kidding? They're still alive because Sonic still exists. Without Sonic, there's no question that Sega would be defunct by now, but I think we're all glad they didn't go away completely. Sega played a huge part in the history of gaming and pushed us to where we are now. Did they make a couple of mistakes? No. They made a million mistakes, but their presence can't be understated. They pushed Nintendo to improve, Sony to improve, and still support both entities plus Xbox. As long as Sonic still exists, Sega will too.
Sega's downfall is something that every new gaming console needs to take a look at and take a few lessons from it. Don't do it! Otherwise, you're going to be on the fast track to dying quicker than Sega did, and nobody wants to fall out of relevancy that quickly. You remember when Sega was relevant? Yeah, I was in my dad's nutsack. What about you?